Hello friends, I welcome you again to this channel Dr. Vipul with Kapoor. Let's learn. Friends, in our previous video, we discussed Christopher Marlowe as the most representative dramatist of the Elizabethan Age. Another important grand literary personality at the end of Renaissance, at the end of the Elizabethan period, whom we see when we are reading the history of English literature, then it is John Milton. And in this video, we are going to appreciate John Milton as a poet of English literature. We are going to discuss John Milton's contribution to English poetry and how Milton has influenced all the rest of the poets after 17th century. John Milton was born in 1608 and died in 1674. So you can say he was a 17th century English poet, and his works have greatly influenced the literary world. John Milton wrote poetry and prose between 1632 and 1674, and most importantly, Milton is known for his epic poetry, Paradise Lost. In fact, Milton is considered as one and only epic poet of English literature. And he exercised immense influence on a host of poets, on a lot of poets of English literature who followed him, who imitated him, who borrowed his style from Milton's poetry. Let's have a look at some of the important works of John Milton. The most important work, the most important contribution of Milton to English poetry is Paradise Lost. It is one of the most recognized works in English literature. This Paradise Lost was published 2 times. The first version was published in 1667 and later it was the same edition was republished in 1674, which consisted 2 books. The later edition consisted 12 books. The previous edition consisted 10 books. Paradise Lost consists of more than 10,000 lines of verse, and mainly it tells the story from the Bible. It tells the story of Adam and Eve. Another important work, poetry, written by John Milton, which is in fact an incomplete work, is Paradise Regained, which was published in 1671. It is a philosophical dialogue between 2 important characters, Satan and the Son of God. The Son of God strives for noble consciousness and internal quality. So Paradise Lost is, a spiritual work of art. Samson Agonists is a play, is a drama which is based on the Greek model, and this had been published by Milton in 1671. It tells the story as told in the Old Testament. So this is also a religious work written by Milton. Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and this one, Samson Agonists. All these are religious works of Milton. Lycidas, which was published in 1637, it's a famous poem, about the death of his friend Edward King. So it's a kind of an elegy. Elegy, it's a song written to mourn the death of a near or a dear one. And John Milton, wrote this elegy, this poem, this lyric to mourn the death of his friend Edward King, whom the poet calls Lycidas in this poem. And this poem is written in a pastoral tradition. Milton has also written L'Allegro and Penseroso II. Both these works consider the internal and external life of the poet through allegory. Milton was in his 20s when he wrote L'Allegro and Penseroso II. At that time, he was a young poet who questions what it meant to be an epic poet. But when after the passage of time, when he was matured, this early work had a major influence on his later writings. As he grew older, his poems became more complex and insightful. By the time he wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, Milton turned blind. And this is something very sad about such a great poet. So this was, we had a kind of cursory look at Milton's important contribution to English literature. In the rest part of this video, we are going to discuss the important characteristics of Milton's poetry. And the most important characteristic of Milton's poetry is Puritanism. It can never be denied that Puritanism is the potent, important force in Milton's poetry. Puritan was a member of that party of English Protestants who worked for the purification of the church and Christianity. Milton's this feeling for religion and church can easily be found in almost all his poetic works. Say, for example, in Lycidas, Milton has tried to expose the corruptions prevalent in the church of his times. So by exposing this corruption, in Lycidas, Milton wants to show red light to the ecclesiastical people of his times. So he wanted to purify the church and Christianity. In fact, Lycidas is full of Puritanism. Milton's last three works reveal his religious and moral fervor at the best. He drew the subject matter of the grand epic Paradise Lost and also Paradise Regained from the Bible. He describes heaven and hell. He talks about God and Satan and Christ. In this way, from all these works, when we read these works, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, even Lycidas, we believe that it is obvious that Milton is not only the highest but the completest type of Puritan in his poetry. Another important characteristic of Milton's works is influence of Renaissance. His poetry is full of Renaissance spirit. Spirit of Renaissance is found in his poetry. The writers of the 17th century were still, they were under the great influences of both the Renaissance and the Reformation, because when Milton was writing poetry, Renaissance recently came to the end. This movement recently came to the end in England, and a new movement started during that time. That was the movement of Reformation. So, Milton was a kind of living in a kind of a transitory period. He was somewhere between Renaissance and Reformation. And Milton was not an exception, because he was also influenced by both Renaissance and Reformation. Milton was as much a child of Renaissance as that of Reformation. Milton inherited all great qualities, characteristics of his age. His hunger for beauty, which is reflected throughout his works. It shows the influence of Renaissance. In the description of the Garden of Eden in Paradise Lost, the feminine charms of Eve in Paradise Lost, the love between Eve and Adam as presented by Milton, all these things suggest that yes, Milton was influenced by the spirit of Renaissance. In Paradise Lost, we find love for Rome. Not only this, if we talk about Milton's love for Roman and Greek literature, Latin literature, which is the dominant note in his poetry, this shows the Elizabethan spirit, this shows the Renaissance spirit, and this his love for Roman, Greek literature, Latin literature, is found in his poem Lycidas and Comus. A critic rightly said about this influence of Renaissance on Milton that, like his great predecessors, Milton successfully blended love of romance, enterprise, and love of beauty with moral idealism and religious fervor. Next important characteristic of Milton's poetry is classicism. Friends, Milton was as much a classicist as romanticist. Milton was a great scholar. His learning was very wide because he studied Latin and Greek authors, Greek philosophies. Thus, a great charm of poetry resulted from his classical bent of mind. His use of large epic similes, just like Homer and Virgil, also suggest that yes, he was a classical poet. Not only this, Milton had complete respect for the ancient literature and ancient philosophies. That's why we may say that Milton was a classicist. And not only this, his grand style, his heavy style of writing, and his phraseological language, and not only this, the sublime themes which he has presented in his poetry also make his poetry classical poetry. Another important feature, striking feature of Milton's poetry is his sense of beauty. John Milton is known as the child of Renaissance because he has an acute love of beauty. The element of love for beauty pervaded, in his poetry in all its forms. Milton has an eye to see the beauty of nature. In Penseroso II, we have an exquisite example of Milton's description of the landscape. Such beautiful description of the landscape presented in this poem. It shows how acute sense of beauty is found in Milton. Let me quote these lines as found here, as you can see here on the screen. To behold the wandering moon riding near her highest noon, like one that had been led astray through the heavens wide pathless way. And this shows his sense of beauty. Milton himself confessed in one of his poetry, he said, I quote, he means God, he has certainly inspired me, if any ever were inspired, with a passion for the good and beautiful. So Milton himself has confessed this thing, that he was inspired by God to see the good and beautiful on this earth. Next important feature of Milton's poetry is his sublimity. The supreme quality, in fact, this is the supreme quality of Milton's poetry. His poetry has the sublime power to elevate and uplift the soul of the reader. Friends, in one of my previous videos, we discussed Longinus and the idea of sublime. So, if you want to really find out this sublime quality in literature, then friends, you must read Milton's works, because Milton's works are full of sublimity. The element of sublime is easily found by the readers in his poetry. According to Voltaire, Voltaire said that Milton never dealt with cheap love or mean subjects. Milton never talks about some mean or very less important topics. His topics, his ideas, his themes are elevated, high, serious themes. And that's why, sublimity enters in his poetry. There are a very few poets like Milton in English literature whose subject matter has this sublime effect on the readers. Milton mostly writes on heaven and hell. He writes about Christ and church. He writes about God and Satan. He writes about spiritualism. In fact, his poetry is full of spiritualism, and this makes his poetry sublime poetry. Regarding this sublimity of Milton's poetry, Addison has also rightly wrought these lines. I quote, Milton's chief talent and indeed his distinguishing excellence lies in the sublimity of his thoughts. So critics also believe that Milton's poetry, Milton's works are full of sublimity. And another last important feature of Milton's poetry is autobiographical elements. Milton's poetry is autobiographical to a large extent. Autobiographical means, you find the glimpses of Milton's personal life experiences in his works. Milton tries to express his personal feelings, emotions, his personal experiences are reflected in his poetry. So, there is an autobiographical element in all his works. His poetry contains his personal experiences, his beliefs, his personal ideas. Regarding this personal nature of Milton's poetry, Coleridge is a romantic poet who lived during the period of Romantic Revival. The period of Romantic Revival means 1798 to 1830. Okay, during this period, Coleridge, S.T. Coleridge, was writing poetry. He is very much influenced by Milton's poetry, and about Milton's autobiographical elements, he has written, I quote, John Milton himself is in every line of Paradise Lost. It is Milton himself whom you see, his Saturn, his Adam, his Raphael, almost his Eve, all are John Milton. Okay. Not only this, in his personal life, Milton was very unhappy. And this unhappiness and dark side of his life, this is also revealed in all his works. Milton has wrought a sonnet called On His Blindness. In this poetry also, in this sonnet, also Milton has tried to express his unhappiness because he had turned blind at the later stage of his life. Not only this, in Samson Agonists also he writes about this, about his blindness. He writes, I quote, "Oh, dark, 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 amid the blaze of noon." This is how Milton expresses his sorrow, his disappointment, or the dark side of his life in many of his poems. Some critics and some poets also have commented about Milton's contribution to English literature. Here, there are hundreds of critics and poets who have commented on Milton's poetry and Milton as a poet, but I have taken Wordsworth and Dr. Samuel Johnson. Wordsworth, in fact, has written a poem on John Milton. I have taken 3-4 lines from that poem, how he appreciates John Milton as a poet. Wordsworth writes, I quote, "Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, and power." Oh, raise us up. Wordsworth tells Milton, please raise us up, please make us masters of this art of writing poetry. Return to us again, please come back. We want to learn something, many things from you. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, and freedom and power. Thy soul was like a star. Wordsworth says that your soul was like a star and dwelt apart. You are always standing apart. You are not an ordinary poet. Always dwelt apart. Thou hast a voice whose sound was like the sea. Your voice, in your poetry, your voice is just like the sea, the roaring voice. This is how pure, and further he says, pure as the naked heavens, majestic and free. This is how, Wordsworth appreciates John Milton's poetry and John Milton's excellence as a poet in English literature. Dr. Samuel Johnson, an 18th century lexicographer and a critic, he also writes about John Milton, I quote, "He can please when pleasure is required." He can please when pleasure is required, but his peculiar power to astonish is immense. So Dr. Johnson wants to say that Milton has the power not only to please the readers, he has the power to astonish the readers. And that power is immense, in Milton's poetry. Friends, before we end this video, let's conclude that Milton's poetry is bubbling with all these qualities, characteristics which you can see on the screen. His high serious thoughts, high serious religious themes, sublimity of thoughts, the spirit of Renaissance and Reformation. His classicism is evident, is obvious in his poetry. At the same time, his romanticism is also found in his poetry, and his Puritan touch or his Puritanism is also easily evident and easily found by the readers in his poetry. In short, Milton was not an ordinary poet. He was an extraordinary poet who wrote on spiritual things. His poems are spiritual poems, right? And his poetry is sublime poetry. It touches the hearts of the readers. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion. If you really liked this video, please share this channel and subscribe to this channel. Friends, stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much.